You who have met me, I'm Paul Kramer. I teach in the history department, U.S. transnational history. My first book was on the U.S. occupation of the Philippines. I'm working on a book on immigration history and another book on the practice of transnational history. I'm working on both those at the same time for reasons I'm not really fully understand. But I'm looking forward to working with all of you in one capacity or another. In terms of what I hope to do today, for those of you who are new especially, right, the grad seminar as a form is going to be a new one, relatively new. I mean, you'll have experienced variants of it as an undergrad, honor seminars, small-scale discussions. But it's really its own beast, and I'll start with kind of a personal anecdote, which was my own initial encounter with graduate seminars coming up on 20 years ago, which was not a successful encounter, I should say. This was something I was not especially good at. As my advisor to this day likes to remind me every time we meet, I did not really speak a word. I may have spit a handful of words during his famed intellectual history seminar. So it was something that I initially was not very good at as a participant, and in the way that can sometimes lead to a kind of self-consciousness where you're trying to figure out how something works because it didn't seem to work for you. I've given it a lot of thought over the past 15 years of teaching graduate seminars at a variety of different places, what works and what doesn't, and kind of what makes a good graduate seminar and what doesn't. And so really in the interests of getting a conversation going with you all about some of, on the one hand, what I think works and doesn't work in a seminar, but then also, for me, the part that will interest me most will be the Q&A, where we talk about kind of what you hope to get out of a seminar, because that's really where I'll learn a great deal. So, and really the idea, the overarching principle behind a lecture like this is to get a conversation going. I'm one person, I have one set of perspectives. Whatever I say here, you should triangulate with other people and get their perspectives on it. But nonetheless, the idea that so much of what we do in the profession and so many of the really important transitions are things that we do not talk about collectively. You're expected to learn them basically by bumping into them, which is not an especially fun or efficient way of learning some of these basic things. So the hope is that by getting a brief conversation going, I spare you some of that discomfort so that, the discomfort you experience will be elsewhere in grad school, right? Grad school is meant to be uncomfortable in lots of ways, but it doesn't need to be uncomfortable around learning some of the basic protocols and things you're expected to do. So that's the spirit in which this talk is offered. So I'm gonna talk for about a half hour, I think, and then open it up. We're hoping to get out of here by around 6. What I'm gonna do is talk briefly about the graduate seminar as a form, and then I'm gonna turn to the other kind of seminar you experience in grad school, which is like the departmental seminar, right? Where you go, you hear a visiting speaker present, the lunchtime workshop where people present their work. So I'll spend a little bit less time on that, but I want to kind of explore that too as another seminar forum that's really important, just to have a handle on why do we do this, what makes it work. And I'm going to end with my own kind of cooked up formula for better or for worse about what I think an ideal seminar question sounds like. And I've sat in lots of seminars over the years, some really functional, some of them tremendously dysfunctional. And I've come up with, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a kind of a formula for what I think makes a very efficient delivery device for your question for speakers. So I'll hold that for the end. All right, so just to start, why take graduate seminars? Why do we do this to each other? I think there are really 3 reasons why we take graduate seminars. First is to make an extended body of work. As an expert in your field defines that body of work, to make that your own. Right? So it's about your engagement with that field and making it your own, absorbing it into your own perspectives, your own vision of how you do history. And that field, I think, should be defined historically. That is a body of things that happened, right? Historiographically, that is the scholarly debates around what happened and how we write about it, and ideally conceptually, which is a kind of more abstract order about how we talk about historical change, how we talk about social processes. Ideally, a graduate seminar is happening on all those levels at the same time. And again, it's a chance where a professor, for better or for worse, puts together a body of literature they identify as a field, and it's a chance for you to make that your own. Now, the second is not about the work itself. It's really about you. And I think graduate seminars are a comparatively efficient way to engage in intellectual self-discovery. That's to say that it's in the context of being inundated with these enormous syllabi that we're busy giving you all, that you have a chance for a kind of dialectical reflection about your own interests, your own themes, your own preoccupations, your own questions. Now, it may seem like, well, I know, that's easy. I can just figure that I can introspect. But actually, it can be comparatively hard to figure out what it is that are your overarching preoccupations. And I feel like there's a way that in the seminar, as you're being ideally exposed to a whole variety of texts, different methods, different approaches, you're going to gravitate to certain of those. There are going to be some that you reject out of hand. There are going to be some that you're ambivalent about. But it's in that dynamic that you're going to be able to engage in some self-reflection about the things that matter to you going forward as a scholar. And the third, and importantly, is it's a chance to learn a set of professional norms that are going to be important to just the professional sociology of navigating a professional life, right? Giving presentations, giving public talks, writing book reviews, engaging in seminar dialogue itself. These are all things that are enormously important practices, and there's an art to each of them, and you don't just learn them on your own. And ideally, a seminar is a place where you get a chance to workshop and develop those, to ask questions about how you do those in a relatively safe space in which you can make mistakes, you can ask what you may think are dumb questions, and you'll get answers to those questions. All right? So making an extended body of work your own, some intellectual self-discovery, and mastering some professional practices. Okay. Now, graduate study isn't pursued through seminars everywhere, right? In the British system, you meet with an advisor for long periods of time. So why do we do it? Why do we get together in groups and do this? Well, I think each of the goals that I laid out above are best really pursued in a group. So I'm a big believer in graduate seminars as a mode of training. You're going to discover the way you think, in part by reflecting on what makes it different from the way other people in the room think. Right? So again, there's a dialectical relationship between you and the readings, but there's also a relationship between you and the other people in the seminar where you're figuring out, wow, my approach is really different. Maybe in ways that I like, maybe in ways I don't like. Right? But that happens, I think, best in a dialogue and in a kind of communal dynamic. Seminars provide you a chance to encounter other people's minds, encountering the same works that you've read, right, from different angles. And it gives you a chance to gather from those readings something that you did not see on your own, something that by definition you would not have seen or not have emphasized in the same way. So there's a cliche among graduate teachers that in a good seminar, the students teach each other, right? And on the one hand, that is a way that professors can let themselves off the hook for not preparing enough, and they often use this cliche to those purposes. But I think it's more than just self-justification for under-preparing. I think there's actually truth to it, that in a good seminar, people are learning from each other positively and critically, right, as they kind of reflect on the way other people are approaching the texts. And so for me, the best metaphors for a graduate seminar are not individualized. They're actually communal metaphors, right? So I'm calling this workshop Good Seminar Citizenship, and I think there's a way that citizenship is not a bad metaphor for thinking about a seminar. It's a kind of temporarily constituted polity. There are rules, there are rights and responsibilities, there are a certain kind of institutional framework. We know that not all citizenship regimes function very, very well. That's also true of seminars. It's also not a great metaphor because it's not a republic. It's not self-governing. It's more of a constitutional monarchy, right? But hopefully, in most cases, a benevolent constitutional monarchy. But nonetheless, I think in terms of some of those metaphors about everybody coming with certain rights, certain responsibilities, I think citizenship is not a bad metaphor. The other I like is to think about a garden, to think about a common plot of land, right, with lots of different things growing in it, and a thriving garden is also one where there's biodiversity, right, where you're not just monocropping, planting lots and lots of the same stuff. And I feel like actually a good seminar is like that too, in the sense that people come with very different angles of vision, very different sort of critical apparatuses, very different preoccupations, and that's what kind of creates a rich topsoil in which everything can grow. A metaphor of a team, right? Everything in America is a team, right? So I won't push that too hard as a metaphor, but I think it's nonetheless a good metaphor if we understand that the only opponent in this particular sport is one's collective ignorance of the topic at hand, right? That's the opponent. You're not each other's opponent. You're fighting something else, which is your own inability to make sense of this body of material. And in that, just like on a team, one person's strengths is going to complement another's weaknesses, right? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I like to think of a graduate seminar as a commons. That's to say a shared space that everybody gets to use, that everybody tends to, and that nobody gets to own, right? And so it's a space that everybody has a responsibility to actually cultivate in order to make sure Not that just extracting what you need, my professional development, my, I've got to figure out my dissertation, I'm going to use this, right? It's not that. It's actually about, achieving one's individual goals, but in a context in which everybody also puts back. It's the only way it can work. Okay, so this is all very up in the air, very abstract. I want to give some practical guidelines. And again, these are the kind of things I wish someone had told me. And I think they might have made a difference. I might not have been so embarrassed around my advisor around these questions if somebody told me these things. But so a couple of practical guidelines about how you approach just a seminar. I think your plan should be to bring at least a half a dozen and maybe more observations, comments, criticisms that cover a wide range of the readings you've been assigned in that class. So don't just focus on one reading, because there may be a chance the professor doesn't get to that reading and then you're out of luck. It'll also be pretty obvious where your reading ended if the conversation's, sort of focuses on that reading and all of a sudden you perk up. So I think in terms of just your general performance, spread your attention widely across the readings and come prepared with something to say, at least one thing to say about every reading. It can be a question, it can be a quibble, it can be a serious argument or reservation, but it should show some real intellectual engagement with the reading. Very briefly, what are you looking for when you read? I mean, this is a whole other topic, but just very briefly. I mean, I think when you approach some of these readings, you can think about the question of ends and means. So what is this book trying to accomplish? What is the end of this book or this article? In what scholarly context are they trying to achieve it? So what dialogue, what set of conversations and arguments are they weighing in on with this work? So trying to get a kind of argumentative context for the work at hand. Is it a worthwhile undertaking? Is this worth the scholarly energy this person put into it relative to the conversation that they're participating in? And to what extent do they ultimately accomplish what they're trying to do? Okay, so that's all on the question of ends. The other is about means. It's about the process that they're using to actually engage in this. What methods, approaches, and sources do they use? And how rigorous are they in applying those? How consistently do they use these methods and approaches throughout the work? And importantly, how well or how not well do the ends match the means? That is to say, have they chosen the right analytic categories, sources to actually achieve the scholarly inquiry they want to? What else might they have tried? You can try on hypotheticals. Where else they might have gone to accomplish the goals they set out, what means should they have taken instead? Okay? A couple of general comments about seminar participation. Make sure to speak at least once, ideally twice, during the first couple of meetings. Even if you're feeling awkward, even if you're feeling like you don't quite know where you are, get something out on the table that's halfway coherent. And I sort of suggest this for reasons that are really extra academic. They're more kind of about sociological observation, which is whenever I participated in a group conversation, the rhythms of that conversation get established pretty early. And just in terms of literally the conversational rhythms, where people are looking for who's going to speak next, and what I've noticed is that those cement within about 3 or 4 weeks. And so if you don't speak early on, it will be actually harder, both for you and for the group, to incorporate your comments when you have them. And again, some groups are more inclusive. They accommodate late arrivals easier. In my experience, though, you want to make sure to kind of send the signal that you're present, that you're going to be participating. Again, even if it's very, very minimal, just so you're not the kind of very loud silence, right, in the room. And I know that having been the very loud silence in some seminars in the past. So I think just getting something on the table, it can be a point of clarification, something very, very small, but just making sure that you're a part of the dynamic from early on. If you're having trouble getting your ideas out on the table, either because of the difficulty you're having with the material or making sense of it, or the dynamics in the seminar. I've been in seminars where there are a lot of really loud, assertive / aggressive people that don't leave a lot of oxygen in the room. That's not a context in which I'm really good at jumping into the conversation, right? And so it's not about the material. It's literally about just like not wanting to step on anybody's toes and not knowing how to do that. If you're running into those kind of difficulties, those are things that you can establish some back channels with the professor with, just to kind of, let them know on the one hand that you are present and accounted for, right? That you're tuned in rather than tuned out, but that your quietness or relative quietness has something to do with what are really relatively small matters that can be accommodated, right? And so, but I think, again, not feeling shame, not feeling like you've got to explain or justify, but I think you just need to point out to the professor, and it's their responsibility to help you grapple with that. And if they don't know that's their responsibility, you should kind of make clear to them that it is. If it's about the material and some sort of conceptual block you're having, that's also really important in terms of establishing some kind of back channels with the professor early on. So they can help you work through some of those knots early in the seminar, because the sooner you work through those, the better, the more easily you can get involved in the conversation. There may be something very fundamental you're missing about the way the class is conceptualized. Why are we even asking this question, right? And hopefully the professor knows the field well enough that they can give you a backstory. Oh, yeah, we're jumping in midway in this conversation. Let me take you back 2 decades and how this whole thing started up, right? And hopefully that will clarify why you're doing it, how the conversation's unfolding. And again, I would do this sooner than later before you psych yourself out. And I don't know, to what extent you all have the capacity to psych yourself out, but if you're like me, that capacity is certainly present. And so enlisting your professor to help you deal with that earlier is an advantage. Okay, psyching yourself out. So most of us, I think, have at least some capacity to conclude that everyone else in the class gets it, that we're the outlier, that a huge cosmic error has been made, and that you don't belong in the room. And to the extent that that's present, and I hope that's not present or not present very strongly in you all, as someone who was on the graduate admissions committee and has been on graduate admissions committees previously, I just want to kind of let you in on an important secret, which is you're already in. Okay, this was already a very competitive process to get you in. So everyone in the department who you'll be working with believes that you're capable of great things in the department. And that doesn't mean that we don't want you to impress us. We want you to impress us by working hard and by working well. But in terms of those ultimate questions about, should I have gone into investment or whatever, you don't need to ask yourself that. You can, but you don't need to ask that, because at least as far as we're concerned, you're all capable of doing really great stuff. If you're psyching yourself out in part because you feel like the perspective or angle that you bring to bear on this material is really weird, is somehow different from what everybody else is bringing to bear, keep in mind that there's a strong likelihood that that is also your superpower, right? That that's also the thing that you do best, that you do better than most other people, and which may, in fact, provide the key to unlocking the questions the seminar is trying to ask. So if you really think of your own intellect as that idiosyncratic in a way that is not favorable to you, keep in mind that it may, in fact, be a big advantage. And it may take you time, and it may take your colleagues time to figure out why that's an advantage. But I think holding on to that can be quite important during the first 2 years of grad school. And because that superpower may be the thing that the seminar needs, it's also your responsibility not to keep it to yourself, right? So in terms of why not be quiet or even silent in a seminar, it's also partly, I think, out of a sense of responsibility to the commons. That's to say that someone in the class needs your insight in order to help them make them a better intellect. And if you don't share that, you're denying them that chance to clash with that idea, to absorb it, to kind of make sense of it, and to make it their own, okay? All right, a subset of the psyching out problem can involve interdisciplinary issues. And that's basically where someone from a different field comes into a graduate seminar, right? So if we're in history, it could be somebody from literature, from economics, from social science. I think this is a particular kind of variation on the difficulties of graduate seminars. I think it can be really important to take seminars in other disciplines. It provides you a very unique opportunity for intellectual stretching, risk-taking, cross-pollinating, cross-training that you don't get in other kinds of settings. But it can also be enormously challenging. I mean, I think a lot of the reason why I had difficulty in my graduate seminars was that I was coming from a broad humanities background that was very strong in literature and critical theory. And I'd taken really a handful of history classes before entering grad school. And so literally the fundamentals about, what are we doing? What does this change over time? And kind of agency, what is agency, right? All these kinds of questions were just not my questions. And what I found I was doing was basically deconstructing the secondary texts as texts, which was freaking everybody out. Like, why is this guy pretending that we're all literature, right? That all this work is literature. And it was because I had a set of interdisciplinary tools that came from somewhere else, and that's what I knew how to do. And so that's what I kept doing. So I think the challenge you face as an interdisciplinary person, if you decide to take a graduate seminar in another field, is to find a way in to that other way of talking. You don't want to spend the entire semester talking the way you talk in a setting where people are talking a different language. I think that produces enormous awkwardness. And you'll know this is a problem if basically every time you speak in a seminar, the room goes silent, right? Or nobody knows how to respond to what is this guy doing, right? And I think you can think about it in terms of language. Like, if you walk into a room and people are speaking one language, and you enter the conversation speaking another language, you're going to stop the conversation pretty flat, right? And so what do you do in that situation? Well, historically, people develop pidgin languages and trade languages, right? You find some common ground over some common terms, and that is what gives rise to some other kind of hybrid language, right? And I think in interdisciplinary seminars, that's the ideal, is you kind of find your way into that field through the things that your approach has in common with that field. And that can be very limited ground. But that's okay, because the real goal of being in an interdisciplinary seminar is to challenge yourself and to stretch. But in order to feel comfortable, in order to feel like you're contributing and learning, being very self-conscious about being like, okay, this is where this field seems to be, this is what I can do and how I approach the world, and they seem to overlap here. And initially, I'm going to stay here. And that can be an extremely generative space, not just for you, but also for the other people in the class. And so the other suggestion I make is even if the room goes silent when you speak, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem, right? Because that could just be processing time that other people need in order to absorb what you have to say. So in terms of you gauging like how much silence is good silence versus bad silence, it's partly about your comfort level. You may also want to touch base with your professor. I mean, there's also a way that, again, if you're generating complete silence throughout the whole semester, it can be distracting. It can really be disruptive to the seminar. So you want to kind of monitor that. But I do think there can be certain kinds of generative quiet that a comment generates when it comes from some interdisciplinary place that people don't know what to do with. Okay? Okay. A couple of other just general comments about speaking up in class. Steer clear, if possible, of comments that are based on real just generalizations about a book or article. I don't like this kind of work. This kind of scholarship really sets me off. You know, that may be true, and there may be perfectly viable reasons why this kind of work sets you off, but there's not a lot that your colleagues can do with that, right? And so you want to try to be as specific about your observations as possible, rather than presenting kind of sheer opinion. Be as concrete about your reaction to a part of the book or an aspect of the book rather than the whole or the type that it participates in. And you always want to present supporting evidence, right? I didn't like the way he or she did this, and here's an example of what they did and why I think it's a problem, right? In terms of comments, takedowns of books or articles are not interesting. They can feel great to get off your chest. They can make you feel very smart, you know, like the kind of righteous slayer of bad scholarship. But ultimately, they're generally not that interesting. They don't lead to an ongoing discussion that's particularly vital. If the professor assigned the material, it's probably because he or she thought there was something worthwhile in it, or that it was really wrong, but in interesting ways or exciting ways. So you're better off thinking about what works and what doesn't work in everything you read, and really trying to think about, you know, kind of harvesting something that works even in a book that you don't really like. What would you like to see moved forward in the scholarship from this work, and what would you like to see countered by the scholarship that comes after it? I think this is a more productive way of keeping the conversation going rather than shutting it down. And I also think it helps us develop the skill of critical fairness, which is, I think, lacking or not as strongly represented in the profession as we'd like. The takedowns tend to be, whether you know it or not, about advertising one's own strength as a scholar, but paradoxically, they actually show real intellectual brittleness rather than suppleness. So I think being able to sort of take a work that you don't like, but find something in it that you do like, or the other way around. Sometimes the more challenging, I think, actually can be a book that you think is fantastic, but then finding something to be critical of can be equally challenging. Here, the real model, I mean, and I've participated in graduate seminars where people come in and the assumption is that this is basically a piranha pool, and that I'm lowering some big side of beef into it every week, right? And it's just everybody's going to pile in. And that, to me, that's not a formula for a constructive seminar, even though it can feel, again, like we're all sort of like knights, right, taking down the forces of scholarly evil. Okay. What to do when the professor assigns their own work in class? I mean, this is something that professors like to do. I've done it, continue to do it. I want to say, first of all, I don't think this is a transgression. I wouldn't do it if I thought it was. And I think it can be a real opportunity, but it can be awkward, and it usually is awkward. So just knowing that it's going to be awkward, that's okay. That's a part of, but there are benefits that come along with that. And basically, I think the main opportunity when a professor presents their own work in a graduate seminar is to get a window onto the production of scholarship. You have a chance to talk to an actual working scholar or somebody who closely resembles a working scholar, plays one on TV, talking about how they came up with their ideas, right? What was the process they went through? How did they come up with this? What obstacles did they face? You know, what was the publication process like? It's a chance for you to get a kind of, inside the actor's studio, where people tell you about the professional process, if they're willing to share that, on something you've read, so you have an encounter with the finished product. And you can, and if they say, yeah, there used to be a paragraph about X, Y, Z, and well, why did that get taken out, right? Or, so what were the choices you made? What were the paths not taken? So I think personalizing the scholarship can be quite important, because there's a way that part of what's very weird about grad school seminars is that you encounter this work and it's very disembodied. There's not a person behind this thing, right? So in terms of then you setting out to say, okay, I'm an actual person, I'm going to try to produce this scholarship, it doesn't give you a lot of guidance to have read all this stuff in terms of how you're actually going to do it. Whereas actually seeing someone that you know in a community setting talk about the vagaries of how this happened can be enormously productive. In terms of whether it's okay to criticize the work, I think that in terms of the ethics of this, it ought to be completely fine to criticize the work. And I think any professor that would hold you especially accountable for being critical of the work is not really living up to the responsibilities of the task. If you put it on the syllabus, it's because it's fair game. It's a part of the commons, and it's available for people to criticize as well as praise. Now that said, people are people, right? And there's a politics to this. And I would caution you that most professors will tell you, please be critical. Let me have it, right? Because professors like to think of themselves as expansive, as elastic, as resilient, right? You should not trust their claims about self-knowledge in that regard. People may over-exaggerate their ability to take on criticism. So you may want to be cautious. I guess I would say you should not hold your fire if you think there's really something that needs to get out on the table. But I think just, again, the pragmatics and politics of this, you just probably want to gauge the professor as you see them and kind of tailor your comments accordingly. If you really hate the work, you probably want to talk about it over beers with your colleagues afterwards, and find a pointed, polite way of asking a question in the class itself. Okay. All right, some questions and comments about tending to the commons, tending to the common space of the seminar. First is making sure that you don't take up more oxygen and more space than you deserve in a seminar. And this depends on the dynamics of the class. If there's a class where you've got a lot to say and there aren't a lot of people that have a lot to say, then maybe there's more oxygen in the room and more space, and that's fine. And then you can take up a little bit more. If there's a long silence, you shouldn't hesitate to step in. That's what it's there for. But if you find yourself jumping in before other people have finished, stepping on other people's toes, then you just want to reserve yourself. And again, I don't expect any of you to be aggressive in that way, but it's just something to kind of keep an eye on. Sometimes that doesn't come out of aggression, it comes out of excitement and enthusiasm, right? But if you find that you're kind of clipping other people's comments, just take a deep breath, okay? Second comment about maintaining the commons is keeping the flow of the conversation. A good seminar has an element to it that's a little bit like an improv session, and if you've ever heard improv comedians talk about what makes a good improv troupe work, it's this principle of yes and, which is to say, someone comes up with a scenario, right? They march onto stage, there's no props, then they kind of just improvise a scenario. The other person taps in to join that. And what they do is they inherit the existing scenario and they take it in a new direction. And they call this the yes and, right? I accept what you're doing, but we're going to go over here, right? And I think a graduate seminar has an important element of yes and to it, right? Which is to say that it's not a series of choppy, individualized comments, right? But it's a kind of current of conversation that explores certain kinds of themes and in which one person riffs on what comes before, takes it in a new direction, right? So if you have mapped out a series of questions based on those readings, keeping a sense of where the conversation is going with respect to what you have on your page so that you can jump in, not with a random question, but with the one that pertains to the conversation at hand. And this is obvious conversational courtesy, but again, it's not necessarily natural to know this for a graduate seminar. But I think, in a way, a good graduate seminar takes on a sequence of sustained conversations. Okay. If you want to change topics, that's fine, but I would try to wait until you get the sense that things have kind of petered out, have either reached a stale point or a quiet point or something. If you have questions about whether that's the case, you can always preface with, I want to change the direction. Is there anyone else who wants to finish up on this current topic of conversation? I think that's a really nice, elegant way of saying, are we ready to move on to another conversation? Okay, another point about the Commons is keeping to time. When people ask you to do a presentation, really keeping to those schedules. Practice ahead of time if you need to. If you're asked to do a 5-minute presentation, don't take 7 minutes to do it. That's more than your share, and it doesn't train you in the professional discipline of finishing papers on time. And you won't be alone if you're an academic who can't keep to time schedules, but since this is week 1, or for many of you week 2, rather year 2, it's early enough that hopefully you can develop some of these professional habits, which will set you in very good stead with your colleagues. Believe me, if you can develop the ability to finish at 20 minutes when you give a 20-minute talk at a conference, chairs will love you, commentators will love you, that will have professional benefits. So it's worth developing that discipline early. Okay, another comment in terms of tending to the Commons is to avoid rabbit holes of conversation. And what I mean by rabbit holes are literally long, deep trenches that may be fascinating to you and to a handful of people working in your immediate field, but are not a broad concern to the general field in the room. If you go down obscure questions, you may take up a lot of energy and time for the room in ways that don't necessarily bring people along or generate, again, a kind of yes and principle. It's very hard to kind of yes and based on something that kind of tunnels deeply into a historiography. If there's something that you want to talk to about with the professor along those lines, that's really a great thing for office hours. But I think it's important to kind of realize that that may not be the best use of a graduate seminar. Okay, a couple of final points about tending the Commons. I'm a big fan of what you could call kind of honest name checking. That is to say that when you're in a seminar and you feel like you're building on something that somebody has said before, going to the effort of actually saying, as Kyle was saying, I just like to riff on what Sarah was saying. I think as long as there's a real link, right? You're not doing it for some reason other than intellectual reasons. I think it's a really important thing to do in a couple of different ways. One is that it signals that that you're not a solitary genius coming up with all this on your own, right? It signals to the room that you're aware that this is a common enterprise. I think that's important. It also shows that you are listening, which in terms of both the group and the professor is a good thing to signal, right? I'm alert, I'm not just jumping in, I've been following all this. The other thing, frankly, is it makes the other person feel good. Who doesn't like having the fact that their comment was registered, picked up, improvised with, right? That always feels good. And so why not just make your teammates feel good, right? So if it makes sense to do that, do it, okay? A little more awkwardly, what about having arguments, right? What about when you're not riffing or taking up what one of your colleagues say, but when you have a difference of opinion? If a good seminar is about the improv principle of yes and, it's also importantly about I beg to differ. And I think that argument is really important to graduate seminars. It's equally important than just kind of pleasant conversation about the ideas. A graduate seminar ought to be a community of argument. And that's not a paradox or a contradiction. The communities can be constituted by the arguments they have, and you could also say that arguments, good arguments, can only happen within communities. That is to say, people that share common reference points and have a mutual agreement that everybody deserves to be at the table. That's how you have a good argument. Now, grad seminar arguments can be harmful. They can be destructive. If they erupt over uninteresting questions, which they sometimes do, if the same ones erupt again and again and again, even if they're interesting, if they erupt between the same tiny group of people again and again and again. So those are things to monitor. If those kind of conflicts are happening, then maybe the professor needs to intervene, maybe the students need to intervene to try to change the dynamic in the class. The places where arguments break out are often the places where the stakes are the highest and the most visible. And so I feel like when the tension gets ratcheted up a little bit in the room, that can often be a really good sign that you're hitting traction, that you're actually getting somewhere, right? Because the stakes are high, the issues are not agreed upon, right? There's some reason why we need to actually work some of this out. The key at those moments is to be aware that they're happening and to keep the tone civil so the arguments don't get personal and there isn't any shaming involved in the argument. So even if you happen to be right about the particular issue at stake, and even if it's a really important issue, you'll have done damage to the common life of the seminar. And frankly, probably will not have been worth it, even if the issue is important. If you damage that common texture, I think you'll have done more harm than good. If you find yourself thinking of another student in the class or the professor as your mortal enemy over some issue, rather than a worthy opponent or rival, and if you have trouble building some sense of connection or solidarity with them, just keep in mind that compared to the vast number of people on the planet that are not in seminar rooms, who do not give a shit about history, who are not reading these obscure books, you are on the same tribe with this person, whether you like it or not. All right, so if you find yourself struggling building a sense of connection and collegiality, just keep that in mind, right? You're choosing to be in this room and so are they, and that gives you a lot of things in common, whether you like that realization or not. Okay. All right, just in terms of wrapping up this particular segment, how do you know you're in a bad seminar? How do you know that there's one that's not working? The professor sets up an interpretive line that everybody has to conform with, implied or explicit. I've been in seminars like that, where literally your comments are being judged against a grid of correct or incorrect. The professor shows off their erudition or cleaves too closely to their own research interests. Also a big warning sign. You'll notice that a lot of my signs of a bad seminar come from the professor. A professor picks favorites, implicitly or explicitly. In terms of what the students can bring to a bad seminar, an over-concentrated seminar conversation in which the focal point is really a handful of people, grandstanding by students, trying to impress the professor, or an acrimonious or disrespectful tone. If you're in one of those, you're probably in a bad seminar. You probably need to think about ways of trying to talk to the professor or your other students about ways of improving it. Now, how do you know you're in a good seminar? The conversation moves around a lot. There's a kind of richly shared commons. You cover a lot of ground in terms of material each week. You go deeply into the works together. And people feel comfortable presenting their ideas and trying out new ones. And often, to me, one of the really signs of a good seminar is basically the only word I can come up with is shtick. It's basically like every seminar develops like a shtick. A set of jokes, a set of reference points, like somebody says something goofy week 2 and that becomes the thing you come back to. Like that's how you know that I think you're in a working seminar, among other things, right? So keep an eye for shtick. In terms of some general closing comments about graduate seminars, I'll suggest that there is something of a built-in tension between what may seem to be two competing tasks that you're approaching in graduate seminars. And to some extent, they are competing. One of them is performance, right? We all know you're trying to convey to your colleagues and to your professor that you're smart, that you know what you're doing, that you're going to be a professional scholar who's worth taking seriously. And that impulse can lead you to want to appear smart all the time, which can also lead you to focus very narrowly on the things that you know you do well. I mean, that's a viable and important thing to be doing in a seminar. But it's in tension with what I think is the most important thing in a seminar, which is actually to take risks. That is to venture out from the places you're comfortable into the areas and approaches that you feel less comfortable with. That involves risking looking dumb or incompetent in front of your colleagues. And that's in direct tension with the natural desire to appear smart all the time. Where you find yourself being pulled between those impulses, I would encourage you to err on the side of risk-taking, in the sense that the profession will have an enormous apparatus for helping you internalize a set of narrow definitions of what you do and what you should be thinking about. And that will come in with surprising speed and force. And grad school, I think, is a place where you can resist some of that, and where you need to resist some of it in order to get the most out of your education. And that can be hard, again, in terms of the very natural impulse to want to perform all the time, but I think it's worth making the bigger challenge, which is to take risks. And ideally, if your professor is set up the way I think professors ideally should be, they'll respect that, and they'll respect it more than someone who plays it safe all the time. Okay? Okay. How are we doing time-wise? Let me...
6:52.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. I went on a long time.
5:52.
5:52.
Oh,
shoot.
sorry.
Okay. All right. All right. Tell you what. Maybe I should just. Well, what should I do? Should I just go to Q&A? Should we just, or?
What do you guys think?
How are you guys doing?
We started at about 6:12.
Yeah, we started
So.
at 6.
All right. Do you guys want me to keep going the way I was going? Do you have time, or? All right.
Go for it.
All right. I mean, I've gone through 4/5 of what I have to say. So, all right. All right. Let me switch gears now and talk a little bit about departmental seminars, right? The format, the VHS here, right? Visiting speaker, some prestigious person, right? Visits us and presents their work. And I just want to give you a couple of brief comments, not nearly as detailed as what I've just given you about why that's important, how to navigate some of that as well. Okay, so why do we do this? Why do we invite these people? Why do they come and present their work? And why should you go to these things when you're busy and being inundated and swamped and not sleeping? And all the things that first and second year grad students do. Okay, first of all, it's a way to familiarize yourself with a much broader scholarly universe than you may be accustomed to encountering. Eventually, you're going to be on search committees. You're going to be on graduate admissions committees. You're going to be asked perhaps to teach in areas far removed from your defined areas. And so having a sense of the broad discipline and not merely your narrow area is really important. And one very efficient way of doing that is spending an hour and a half in a room with an expert talking about it. So that's one reason. It's a way to stay conversant with the broad profession of history that you're trying to enter. Second, it makes your own research richer and more complex if you're in dialogue with lots of different kinds of scholars. So it's worth going to scholars, even if they don't look like they're going to be interesting. I think it can be important to be there because you never know what kind of alchemy is going to happen in the back of the room when you're kind of half daydreaming and half tuning in, and then something clicks and they say something, and that becomes the key that unlocks something in your own work. That's happened to me myriad times. Not because I'm not paying attention, but a lot of people will talk about that process of, I'm there, I didn't think this was going to be interesting, and then something clicked. And if you're not in that room, that's not going to happen. The other reason is professional preparation and socialization. This is what your job talk is going to look like eventually, except you're going to be sweating, and you're going to be wearing, you're going to be dressed up. But you're going to be at the front of the room presenting some work. So getting a sense of what works in a talk, what doesn't, how the speaker engages the audience, those are things that from a very early on you want to be learning, because this is the stock and trade of what we do. Giving talks, giving job talks, this is what interviews look like. So it's a chance for you to get a sense of a rehearsal in a way through somebody else. Let them sweat it out. I'm just going to watch and see what works and what doesn't work. Okay. The other reason in terms of going and participating is that in a department, it helps you establish a public profile. That when you ask questions, it's a way that people that you don't encounter regularly in the department, they can get to know what you're about, how you think. And that's important when you're starting out in grad school, but it's especially important when you're starting a job, where you're going to eventually be coming up for review by a lot of people that are not going to see you very often. And if you're in seminar and you ask smart, engaged questions on a regular basis, it will help create a reputation, and an honest reputation, for someone who is sincere and smart and engaged. Okay, so some comments on the kinds of comments and questions to ask to a visiting speaker. So why participate? Well, the same reason that you participate in a graduate seminar. You're curious about something. You think someone else in the room might be curious about the same thing. You want to get to the heart of some key issues with the help of your colleagues. Don't ask a question if you think it's because you want to nail the person. You want to let off some steam. You want to show off. If you hate the work, again, gripe about it afterwards with your colleagues, but ask a sharp, polite question in public. I really think it's important to take the hospitality part of guest speakers seriously. They're not a part of the commons in the same way because they're a visitor into the community, but nonetheless, in terms of a broad culture of civility in the profession, I think it's really important. I think there's a tendency in the profession to mistake sharpness and meanness, which I think has something to do with the ways that a certain masculinist ethos came down through the historical profession from the early 20th century. But I think the sooner we can work that out and realize that actually meanness can distract from sharpness in important ways and generate more heat than light. If you really want to devastate a paper, ask a polite, searing question that will dismantle the argument without them even knowing that your temperature is going up. The other reason to ask a question is because you want to help a colleague at your university or somewhere else strengthen their work, right? So there's really a part of this that, again, is about creating community, helping each other out. We all rely on each other's criticisms to make the work stronger. And so it's part of the crucial collective endeavor of scholarship is putting in the time and energy and labor to read other people's work, to come and comment on it, with the understanding that eventually this will come back to us in some form or another. Okay, a couple of general comments about asking comments in seminar. Don't effusively praise the paper. Even the kind of, I really love this paper, thank you so much. It's very polite and it can help set some nice rapport, but it does take up time. There's not a lot of substance to it. So if you feel compelled to do that, or if it's a reflex, make it short. Like the paper, question. Okay, so that's self-situating. This is something people do in comments all the time. As someone who comes from this very different field, all right, I just want to ask this question. You can really take out the preliminaries. Again, it takes up time, it takes up oxygen. It usually doesn't have a lot of substance. It ends up being an apology for the question you're about to ask. And why apologize? If you feel like you need to apologize for your question, don't ask your question, right? So I think in terms of self-situation, I don't think you can really keep it to a minimum or really minimize it. Try not to ask the same kind of question at every seminar. It makes the conversation stale and predictable. And the same question isn't going to be salient to every work that people present. So if you're the one always asking that question to every paper, right, it sends a message to your colleagues about your own rigidity. And it doesn't really necessarily promote the richest conversation. You'll be typecast as someone who just does that, and that means that your authority on other areas may be diminished, which particularly when you're starting your career, you want to demonstrate a breadth of curiosity and expertise. Again, don't ask rabbit hole questions to visiting speakers. You can approach them afterwards at the cocktail hour and really kind of grill them about something in your own research, but really try to keep to issues that are not inside baseball questions. In terms of general decorum, don't quote the person's paper at length. Sometimes you see this. As you say on page 18, and I quote, right? Even if your comment is meant in the best of spirits, it will come off as aggressive and hostile. That move in and of itself signals a prosecutorial approach, which may be your intention, maybe it's not, but you're always better off just paraphrasing. If there's a crucial couple of words they use that you want to highlight, just use those couple of words. But I think just, don't do the prosecutorial quotation. Okay, in terms of when to jump into a conversation, right? So usually at seminars, someone will keep a list. So how do you know when you want to jump into the conversation? Well, I think one thing to think about is if you connect to this work in a serious way, you've got a big thematic agenda-setting question that comes out of this field. You have strong opinions about it, you know a lot about the field, and its stakes are high. You may want to think about asking a question early. In fact, you may have a responsibility to ask a question early. Because otherwise, the conversation can kind of go down a bunch of rivulets that are not significant or important, right? And it may be that the person closest to the field who's thought about it the most can really help shape that in a profound way. Jump in later if you think your question is small scale, more obscure, that it may be a tangent. If you ask lots of tangential questions early in a seminar, it can really derail the seminar quietly without anybody really noticing. And suddenly you're just going down a bunch of different paths. Nobody really knows where it's going. So if you have something you think is relatively small, holding off until later in the game can be good. If you aren't sure whether your question is big or small in scope, err on the side of waiting. The conversation may change. It may meander in the direction of your comment in ways that highlight its importance, and that may be a great moment to jump in. Okay, follow-up questions. Do you get to ask follow-up questions? It depends on the local seminar culture. So if you just learn the rules as they're constituted in the seminar as you go. Spend a couple of sessions listening in, seeing what local practices are. If follow-ups aren't asked, don't ask them. If the seminar speaker didn't answer your question, really, don't call them out on it by asking a follow-up and saying, well, you didn't really answer. Again, that's potentially destructive and shaming kind of behavior. You can use the opportunity to restate the question in a way that isn't obvious. That's something you can do. It's especially easy to do that if they say, did I answer your question? Never say no when they say that, but you can use that as an opportunity to pivot, restate, find a different aspect of the question. Okay? Okay, a final comment is to start asking questions early and often. This is something that's really important to kind of get comfortable with. Again, graduate school may not seem to be the safest place to try to do that because you're trying to make an impression, but it's much safer than many of the places where you all will eventually end up in jobs where you're trying to perform for your livelihood. Getting in a setting whether it's a small seminar where you can ask questions, practicing some of these skills and other skills, grad student run seminars or conferences is really important just in terms of getting a handle on some of these practices, getting comfortable with them so that when you're really on stage, you've already made them your own. Okay? All right, that's all I've got to say. I've got this template for seminar questions, but that may be extraneous. I can do that, or I can go right to Q&A. What do you?
We'll start with questions.
All right, let's do that. Okay. So, yeah, what do you guys think? I've inundated you with lots and lots of stuff. So, but some of you have participated in graduate seminars here or elsewhere. So, yeah, I'd be really interested in just your own insights about what works and what's worked for you and what hasn't worked and things like that. So.
Well, great talk. I'm not in this field. So I'm trying to even make it work. I have a few really specific questions, so I'll just have one and we kind of go after.
Yeah.
As to the first kind of 4 bits of your discussion, I was wondering, how do you feel about book dropping in class? When someone's giving a response and says oh, well, there's this book that says this and this, because I do that all the time. I'm saying as a frequent violator of this. And if not a lot of people have read that book, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that can be good. Yeah, I think that can be really effective. I mean, I think it's kind of all about how it's executed. And I think it needs to be detailed enough to make the point that you want to make with that book, right? So the reason why this book I'm bringing in from the outside is salient is because of this, right? And something that goes just beyond the reminding, right? Oh yeah, this is kind of thematically, right? It should be, what we really need is this author in the table, right? So I'm going to bring them. But I think to the extent that as you're bringing that author up, people haven't read them, or you can presume that they may not have read them, keeping it pretty succinct. That it's, but I feel like that can be really important just in terms of there may be someone else in the room who's really excited about that theme, and you're helping them zero in on a book that could be important for them. And if you don't say that, then that's not getting communicated. So I think as long as it's kind of very focused around the point at hand and is kind of bounded, I think that can be great. So.
I mean, it works sort of the same way when you write, right? You don't introduce a book just to say there is a book on the subject. You have to.
Yeah, right.
It has to be connected, and you have to answer a question with it. So I feel like if you think about it, and I think everyone knows how to write, but it's just when we talk, we do it less well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think also the way to not do that is at the tail end of someone's contribution to say something to the extent of, sounds like you haven't read this book. Let me give you a citation in the middle of everyone right now, and just, I really hope you read this because you sounded ridiculous. That kind of,
Right.
This
No, exactly.
That's normally how I do it. But
I've noticed that.
I wanted to say that, I think as well, just always running it through the rubric of, is this going to be helpful? Or is this me sort of showing off, that I know this or that, the other thing, because I often find that there are certain books you talk about a lot, right, that come up in conversations. And so I think, referencing those books is one thing, but if it's some other obscure book, maybe it's a rabbit hole situation.
Yeah.
And maybe you're just, showing
trying to show if you read some obscure book.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think it's a fun one.
Yeah, I think in terms of times not to do it, one would be at the end of somebody else's comment, right, as a way of kind of like, oh, it sounds like you haven't read this, and then and the other would be where you essentially plunk a book down. The person has come up with the argument of a book that you've read without having read it, and you essentially say, oh yeah, that's exactly the same as this, right, or something like, right, where, and again, that's really about monitoring. It still might be nice to have that book reference on the table, but in terms of the commons, right, and creating a shared space, that clearly alienates that, or kind of makes it, that harms that. And so I think really monitoring that, that interpersonal dynamic is really important. And the other thing I guess I would just suggest is, even though I think it can be really helpful, monitoring how frequently one does it. I think merely because if you do it regularly, even if it's really intellectually generative, it can seem ostentatious, even if it's not. You become the person who does that, yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the seminars here, just classrooms in this room, and then at VHS, a lot of it's probably a kind of a training ground for presenting and participating at conferences.
Yeah.
And you asked us to ask sharp questions, but broadly, could you, I don't know, just say a few things about either presenting or participating in conferences that may be different from the environment here?
Yeah, well, I think the question of what makes a good conference paper is its own talk. It's its own thing, because it's a very peculiar kind of genre. And it's its own art form, and it's one that people don't, we practice a lot, we don't talk a lot about what makes it work or not work. In brief, I think kind of starting with an assumption about the way that people's attention spans work. So like literally kind of cognitive psychology, and I'm not an expert at all, but I've just seen all these graphs where if you look at people's attention span in a 20-minute talk, it plummets after minute 8 or something like that, right? So what looks like homogeneous text on your page is in fact like rapidly diminishing returns, right? So there's, on the one hand, like making sure that your key points and arguments are in minute 2, right, is important. I mean, another is that there's a reason why people begin with stories. I mean, it's a cliche, a lot of historians do it, but there are also good cognitive psychological reasons which have to do with narrative and have to do with the ways that what a speaker has to do is literally to kind of harmonize their approach with their audiences in a context where they're a stranger to that person. And narrative is much easier to do that with than concepts. And so there's a reason why people begin using something very concrete, and then you climb what people will call the ladder of abstraction, right? You begin with an episode, that episode illustrates an historiographic point that I'm trying to make. Here's the literature I'm taking you into. Now I'm going to go back to my history and take you through the story, right? So there's a reason why papers are often structured that way. I think what people say about like make 3 points, like don't try to make 10 points, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there are a bunch of other kind of, things I think which make a better and worse. I think in general, if you can really try to address your audience rather than reading from the page, it makes a huge difference in terms of eye contact, in terms of people listen to a read paper in a very different way from the way that they listen to a spoken paper. I mean, I've just seen that as someone who for many years could only read and within the last 5 years developed the ability to give papers from an outline. And I've just noticed the difference in reception. So, but maybe that's for a future talk by me or by somebody else about kind of thinking about, because the 20-minute conference paper format is its own very unique kind of thing. And I think it's something that's really worth focusing on, because again, it's something that regardless of how far you go in the profession, like if you're a senior full professor, someplace fancy, like you're still going to get 20 minutes, and so knowing how to use it effectively is really important, and it's a skill we don't teach that much. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
I have a question. I've been thinking about how to articulate this, but you talked about the means and ends of a book,
Yeah.
right? And how to sort of approach a book in that way in the seminar and in a constructive way to think about the book. But I'm also thinking about sort of the means and ends of the seminar itself.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, one of the things that I got in my first 2 years of doing seminars here was a better sense, I wouldn't even say necessarily a clear sense, but a better sense of how to position my own work historiographically.
Mm-hmm.
What are the key ideas, questions that historians are interested in? What have they written about certain themes and So this really relates to what you were talking about with regards to criticizing a book in the seminar. Do you have a sort of constructive way of thinking about how to engage a book critically, historiographically, vis-a-vis your own work? Because I know we've talked a little bit about this in terms of the art of positioning your work, right, relative to this body of work. And is the seminar a place to do that? Is that a means by which you can start thinking about how to do that, right? Should that be one of the ends of sort of seminar?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think it should be and can be. I mean, I think in part because you'll see how people write their book introductions when they're positioning themselves, right? How are they situating what they're doing in terms of the existing scholarship? There are lots of ways of doing it, sometimes really polemically, right? Sometimes by really neglecting the field and overemphasizing one's originality, right? Sometimes people will situate their field, their work in 5 fields, and it's this kind of like crazy zoo of literature that they're kind of corralling, right? Sometimes they will, you know, it's like, you know, Captain Ahab going after the white whale. It's like, there's this one book, and I'm going to take it down, right? I mean, so there are lots of different ways of configuring the historiographic intervention. And some of that has to do with the way the field is structured. Is it a full field? Is it an empty field? Like, and then some of it has to do with your personality, frankly, and just how pugnacious you are or not in terms of picking a fight. You know, there are people who, by personality, like to come in and swinging. There are some people who like to come in and say, I'm joining a forward march, and I'm just another foot soldier, right? You know, so some of that is about personality. Some of it is about the field you're working in. So some of it is about temperament, and I think that's an important factor in it. I do think that it's important to, regardless of where you are on those spectra, to balance some sense that you owe something a lot to the existing literature, and you have something decisive and critical to say that has not been said in that literature. Like, finding a way to say both those things in your introduction seem to me irreducibly important, right? If you don't acknowledge what's there before, you're intellectually self-deceived on the one hand, and you're also going to set yourself up for failure, because the people that are going to come to your panel are going to be the people who wrote the books that you read and didn't cite, and they're not going to be happy, okay? So there's a politics to it, but there's also, in terms of a spirit of generosity and recognition that I think helps the profession as a whole, I think that's also really important. But on the other hand, if you're just another foot soldier, then why should they read your book, right?
Exactly.
So you need to come up with some language that balances and keeps in some sort of dynamic tension. Yes, I owe an enormous amount to the existing literature. I stand on the shoulders of giants, blah, 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 right? But I've got something new to say that's worth saying and important, and that's going to change the picture in some important way. So, yeah.
Oh, I actually have a comment that feels like it springs right from yours, but it was on the issue of your second why we do seminars, right? Exploring your own scholarship.
Yeah.
And especially putting that in seminars, how we explore our own scholarship by making another scholar's body of work art. And I think what I found, and this I feel is maybe particularly to our program, given the new kind of pacing that we've developed, which is doing comps in the spring so that second years don't have that kind of extra padded opportunity of doing comps reading over the summer, and that your second years are very devoted to covering their own comps reading.
Right.
And so what I found as a first year was that it felt like a lot of our required courses were for the second years, and the first years got to witness second years go through the comps lists in class. And so that was an interesting seminar dynamic, but a lot of what Kyle was describing about introducing books that you've never heard of because they've never been assigned to you, right? That that your colleagues are reading outside of the course and they're trying to grapple with, but they're using class time to do it, which is some real prime real estate, right?
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you have any kind of comments on how our program has, to some extent, perhaps like incidentally affected the seminar format
Right.
with the comps reading, making sure that second years aren't commandeering conversational space
Right.
to that extent. But also making it a generative play for first years to be introduced to scholarship that they wouldn't otherwise, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, and almost every program I've been a part of, second year is the crunch year, where you're doing all this kind of stuff. I mean, right, where you're doing your comps, you're doing seminars, you're writing research papers. Some of you are applying for grants in the fall of your second year in some cases, right? So, and on some level, I mean, there are trade-offs to setting up that way. I think ultimately there are more advantages than not, in the sense that I was part of the move to shift it in this direction, so I'm a partisan. But
Yeah, I think the trade-off is huge.
right.
Yeah, I just, as a second year.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think when it comes to the seminar, I think it's one of these things where I think there are more advantages than disadvantages of people bringing in outside readings, as long as it's within bounds, right, and proportional to, and as long as the task at hand is enriching the conversation, rather than, I didn't read these books that were assigned, but I happen to be reading for comps, and so I've got this on my mind, and I'm gonna get a place at the table and get my checkbox for participation. If that's part of your thinking, I'm not saying it would be, but then best not, right? Because then it's not being driven by the intellectual project. But if it makes intellectual sense, then by all means bring it in. I don't think there can be any peril in that, really. And frankly, for first years also, to see second years, engaging in that juggling act, and also bringing in material, and how you do that is really worth seeing. I mean, just in terms of one's own, as with most institutions, your socialization doesn't happen from me; it happens from the people the year ahead, right? And so being that person juggling all that stuff and making it work can be something that's really good in terms of modeling for people that are coming up. So.
I guess I'm going to raise the issue with you because you're here, but it's not really sort of like a general problem in the profession. But I've really noticed that we talk a lot about being concise and respecting time limits. No one ever does it. And I've only once actually in seminars seen anyone be reprimanded for exceeding a time limit in a flagrant way.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, as someone who sort of on the spectrum is a little bit terse, I have been approached and said you're supposed to talk for 20 minutes, you talk for 17 and a half. Okay.
Well, people have actually criticized you for being
so
too. Wow.
And I think that also in general, it's much more valued to kind of be verbose and go over time limit. And I don't know. I mean, you're not the only one who said you should respect time limits, and it's an important part of professional development, of sort of being respectful to other people. But I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think it's something about the, the anti-authoritarian dimensions of humanistic scholarship, which I think is really good. That often when you get a chair of a commentator, a chair of a panel, and they tell you they're going to keep to time, as you say, they usually don't keep rigid time, which ends up cutting into the Q&A, right, which is cutting into the commons in a broader sense. Interestingly, I mean, if they're going to be hardcore, they often really make a joke out of it. I'm going to be a dictator, kind of, right? But I think that often really works in a panel. I mean, where,
in conferences, I see it happening, but in seminars especially, I think it's really free for all.
Yeah, it tends to be. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a delicate balance. I have to say, as someone who's taught a lot of graduate seminars, it can be a very tough challenge, because on the one hand, you want to inculcate that as a value, and it's important in terms of monitoring the commons, making sure everyone's got enough time, right? So the only way to do that is to make sure nobody takes up more than their share in a formal sense. On the other hand, to the extent that as a teacher, part of what you're trying to do is make sure that everyone feels they've got a room at the table and that they belong, and it can be hard to do that in a way that doesn't feel like a smackdown. And we all can have reasonable expectations that we're not all just like puff pastries. They're going to collapse if somebody says something. On the other hand, for somebody to say, hey, enough, it can feel really crappy. And so I think as a teacher, it is challenging, because it's an important principle, but you want to keep a positive tone that just keeps everyone feeling like they belong. And so I feel like I've been in situations, I definitely have told people to pipe down in seminars. But it's only been when, it tends not to be during a presentation. If it's a presentation, I'll tell them, okay, guys, one more minute. It's really, a lot of the way people do during a conference, often they hold you up the numbers, right? 1 minute, 2 minutes. You give people some warning, and then you have the big red sign that says time, right? And I feel like you give people some warning. Where I will cut people off in graduate seminar, and I'll warn for those of you in my seminar, is people who are ranting, right? Where you're on a roll, you're just there's righteousness and there's anger and there's critique and it's just ego and it's this huge ball that's just going downhill. That's where I'm just we're like, no, we're going to stop you, right? And that, I'll give them some time if it's, constructive, but that's where I really will enforce the time limits. Because with a presentation, that involves a certain kind of discipline and practice, which is something that, it's something that it's nice for us to expect from first and second years, but also understanding, like so many of these disciplines, it takes practice. So shaming somebody or making them feel bad is not worth it. On the other hand, when somebody's ranting, they're changing the climate of the room in ways that I think is destructive of the conversation, in ways that I feel like taking up an extra minute of a polished, focused, smart presentation that's just going a little long, I feel like it's a different thing for me. But people are going to differ on that. So, but I'm surprised that people would criticize you for coming in at 17, because whenever I am in an 18 minutes, 20 minutes slot, and I come in at 18, usually the chair comes up to me after, that was so focused, that was so, people seem so grateful whenever I do that. I never do it, but when I do, so.
I'm sure it'd be great, right?
Yeah, right, so. Yeah, so. Yeah, sure.
So, maybe about the fifth of your paper, the departmental seminars, and in particular I'm thinking about VHS, but also to some extent the Americanist seminar, which are the two main seminars I'm involved with. How do you feel, and to what extent should insider questions be fielded?
Yeah.
Because I found a lot at VHS last year, and I think this was kind of the common critique, was that there are 4 experts in the field and the person presenting, and they would all kind of get in a really interesting conversation that a lot of people would observe, right? And it can get the same way in the Americanist seminar, but you get a lot of people who have very specific knowledge about one thing.
Right.
So just as both a person who has done that, as well as someone who has observed it, how should we try to negotiate that as the person asking questions as well as the person receiving the question and dealing with it?
Yeah. I mean, my take on that is that, it's the responsibility of the people who ask the early questions, especially, to keep them really broad. Broad in the sense of, historiography, conceptualization, setting up the historiographic terrain a little bit for non-insiders with the question itself, right? I feel like a really good question can set up some of that context for people that are not part of the conversation. I feel like a person who jumps in and the first question is, zeroing in on some tiny book or article this person is arguing with that you're the only other person, is really doing an enormous disservice to the seminar, because they're closing down the conversation very quickly and really lowering the stakes very quickly. And so when I said that you should jump in early, that's not necessarily you should jump in if you're an expert, because often what happens is the experts are the people that can go down the rabbit holes. Often the people that ask the really generative early questions are one step removed from the field, right? They're maybe proximate in region or time, but they're not exactly there, right? And so they can see the bigger picture, and their question is more likely to be one that a broader community can apprehend and engage in. So I actually feel like, I've also seen in seminars people that do that, and I find it really frustrating, especially because the speaker is then obliged to answer that question in as smart and erudite a way as they can, and then you end up with this very narrow conversation, which sometimes has follow-ups, and then you're not attending a seminar anymore, basically. You're sitting on what ought to be somebody's coffee hour, right? And so, I do feel pretty strongly that, that especially those early questions. I feel like later in the game, when energy levels are dropping and there's a sense that things are winding down, if you want to zero in on something, then fine, especially if there's not a lot of other issues in the room that need to get worked out. But I do feel like there's a distinct role for the buttonholing the person after the seminar that is its own distinct conversation. And often those can be the really exciting conversations if it's a field that you're interested in, and those can be 20-minute one-on-one conversations, but that's its own distinct thing. And I think there's an art to knowing when you should have that conversation and when it needs to happen in public. So I think, asking yourself, is the question that I'm about to ask one that I can plausibly imagine would be interesting to somebody else in the room, is a worthwhile check. Now, the risk is that if you ask that too strongly or sharply, you can censor yourself, right? Especially early on in grad school where you're thinking, does anybody think I'm smart enough to be here to participate, right? Don't take it that far. So I feel like if you're asking yourself it as a way of inhibiting you from participating, then just go ahead and ask and don't worry about it. Because I think it's actually more important, especially for early grad students, to get experience asking questions. And I feel like in a way the rabbit hole problem, it's a problem, but I feel like the more challenging one is making sure there are a lot of people participating, right? So that's a risk worth taking. But I do feel like ultimately moving towards the model where you have a sense of where your question is on the spectrum of decisive conversation shaping versus I'm just curious about.
I think what struck me most when I first started taking seminars here, and also relate to your theme of psyching yourself out, was kind of the ways that seminars at Vanderbilt, and I think most graduate seminars in history, are much more kind of historiographically oriented than what we might call content. Right? So there is 0% lecture, right, involved in our seminars because they are discussion-based. I think to some extent for those of us, especially those of us who did not come in with master's degrees prior and only maybe had the opportunity to write 1 or 2 thesis-length papers, or didn't come from undergraduate degrees in history, like kind of a feeling of a lack of content, right?
Right.
You are just lacking kind of the facts and data that you feel are necessary to inform your contribution or even perception of a book. I remember reading some of the first books that we did in U.S. Civility, like I have no idea how to evaluate this author's
Right.
argument because I do not have access to the wider world of facts that
Right.
they're dealing with.
Right.
And so this is to some extent, I guess, a citizenship kind of student issue about when to when to kind of weigh it out and let those who have that content discuss and then interject accordingly, but also pedagogically how to handle that when your students are coming from such different levels of expertise in terms of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think as a teacher, the first thing you need to do, I think, is to convey to the students that, like, if there's some backstory to either the historiography or the history they need, that's what office hours, like your doors open, like I think just really making that clear early on, is an important first step. I feel like it is challenging as a student because, as a seminar, even within a seminar, as it moves from week to week, there are going to be people that have like deep historical knowledge and historiographic knowledge. There are going to be some places you only connect historiographically. There are going to be some you don't have any connection at all. I think there's a way that having some understanding that whatever you're kind of being parachuted into, like you have something interesting to say about it because you've read all this other stuff in other fields. I think that's something that we underestimate. I think we tend to have very narrow notions of what expertise is. As a base of factual knowledge, I think, in a way, like some sort of textbook understanding of, well, I went through these textbooks, and that's certainly important, right? I think, but I do feel like a lot of the really interesting things that happen in a conversation actually happen from kind of random, kind of glancing moments where somebody makes a connection that is unlikely, right? That comes from the fact that they actually haven't been a part of the conversation. And that doesn't necessarily lead to the smoothest conversation in the sense they can sometimes stop things. It can be a moment where everyone's got to adjust a little bit. How do we assimilate this into the conversation? Do we assimilate it? But I do feel like those can be really generative moments. So, and here I draw my own experience because I think part of what my experience in grad school was I was coming from this like humanities heavy but history light kind of background, and I really had this knowledge of like there's this mythical body of material that I should have mastered and that everybody else seemed to have mastered, and in many cases they had. But I think actually realizing that if we've let you into this program, it's the presumption that you have what you need, right, in terms of your processing power and your capacity, and that can come from another discipline, it can come from another field of study. So, but I also think that, again, in pragmatic terms, if you really feel like I have no idea what happened, going to the professor and saying, give me the 2 books, or textbook chapters or whatever, the encyclopedia entry on this thing, and they should be able to help you with that, and there's a huge industry of literally like encyclopedias of U.S. history, right? That are not textbook, but they're just literally 3-page entries on like what was the silver stuff about during populism, or like how did the U.S. get involved in World War I? Right, and they're like, somewhere there is 3 pages, really smart, written by a top scholar that can just give you that backstory. And so, but a professor should be able to help you do that. So.
Still just blown away by the free silver. We have a lot to talk
Okay.
about.
Okay.
We can go somewhere.
Yeah.
Dr. Kramer, thank you.
Okay, thank you guys. Thanks a lot.